Hi there, my name is Richard Hemming and I am the editorial consultant on jancisrobinson.com. This is the pilot episode of Ask Us Anything, which is the podcast in which we answer the questions of you, the jancisrobinson.com readers. I'm going to hand over to Sam to do the introduction.
Hi everyone, this is Sam. I usually host jancisrobinson.com's Wine News in 5 podcast, but today I am hosting our brand new Ask Us Anything podcast. First, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions, and if you would like to submit a question for next episode, you can go to jancisrobinson.com and you can go to our forum, which is under the community dropdown, and you'll find a spot where people are dropping their podcast questions and just pop it in there. Okay, so for our first question, Onnina from Finland asks,
Hi, this is Annina from Finland. I'd like to know what are called the sparkling wines produced in the administrative region of Champagne, but not in AOC Champagne area. Are they always simply Vin de France? Also, according to your knowledge, are there any producers outside the AOC area but within the region of Champagne that produce Vin de France following AOC Champagne rules? Thank you. Bye.
Okay, this is a very specific question, and there is a sort of sidebar answer that I also want to go down, which isn't exactly what Annina asks. So let me just address what she asks first, because there's two parts to the question. One is, what are the sparkling wines called in the administrative region of Champagne, but not within the appellation? So the administrative region of Champagne, it used to be one region called Champagne-Ardenne, and then that got broken down into, I think it now covers 5 different regions. So if you were making a sparkling wine from within those regions, but outside the Champagne area, the quick answer is yes, it would be called a Vin de France. There is no appellation covering those other areas. Then she also asks, are there any producers outside the appellation but within the region of Champagne that produce Vin de France following those Champagne rules? Well, not to my knowledge, and I've asked a few other people as well. So specifically, if you're looking for Champagne producers making a sparkling wine within the administrative region but outside the appellation boundaries, no, nobody's doing that. So I think what's interesting about this question is why Annina's asking it. It raises the possibility that somebody within Champagne could produce a Vin de France. Why would they want to do that? Who knows? I mean, perhaps they want to slightly go outside the rules, or perhaps they think that Champagne is no longer the powerful, respectable brand that it used to be. I mean, I don't know anybody that's realistically going to take that kind of decision. I proposed an April Fool piece years ago to Jancis in which Moet exited the Champagne appellation, and she rejected it because she said it was just too believable. And I hasten to add, this hasn't happened, in case Moet Hennessy's lawyers are listening. But that's a kind of instance where you think, actually, Moet is such a massive brand. If you took the word Champagne off their label, who would notice? To go back to the original question, which was, like, are there any producers making sparkling wine within the Champagne administrative region, but not within the AOC itself? Not as far as we know, Annina, and thank you for your question.
all right, moving on. Daniel from the UK asks, being a big fan of aged wines, I have often wondered what factors determine a wine's ability to develop tertiary flavors. It obviously seems related to ageability, but also not fully. Having a bit of experience with aging Bordeaux, I've found that some indeed develop beautifully while others seem to lose fruitiness without getting anything in return. I also can't always predict this process based on the price of wine. I fondly remember the second wine of some unknown to me estate's 2002 vintage just blowing me away in 2016, while I've recently been disappointed by a 2010 Pauillac Grand Cru Classé. Would be very interested in hearing the team's thoughts. Richard?
Yes. Well, the good thing about the answer to this question is that to a certain extent you can say that nobody knows. And then we could just move on. But actually, I've tried to come up with slightly more information. A lot of this just comes from the Oxford Companion, which has got a really excellent section on aging. So firstly, just a quick definition. If you've done WSET classes, you'll have come across this word tertiary, and it's most easy to define as flavors that develop in bottle. So primary flavors are from the grape or the fruit. Secondary flavors are from fermentation or maturation, so oak or lees and other things. And then tertiary flavors only happen after bottling, especially if we're talking about red Bordeaux. That's exactly what we mean. So I'm just going to quote a bit of the Oxford Companion about what happens to reds. So during maturation in bottle, a wide range of flavor precursors that were attached to glucose detach themselves through a natural and time-dependent process of hydrolysis and contribute their individual flavor characteristics to the older wine. So that seems like a pretty solid fact, right? You've got your bottle of wine has the potential for tertiary flavors, for complexity, when you buy it or when it's very young. And then it just takes time for that to develop. There's a bit more. Other flavor compounds responsible for the initial aromas of the grape and those of fermentation, sometimes called secondary aroma or secondary bouquet, are also interacting with each other and with other phenolics, so that gradually the smell of the wine is said to be transformed by a pathway not yet understood into a bouquet of tertiary aromas, a very much more subtle array and arrangement of flavors which can be sensed by the nose. So not only are those flavor precursors there, but the other compounds which give you the primary and secondary aromas are also interacting. But as it says, through a pathway as yet not understood.
I do want to propose that while Daniel says he can't predict the process based on price, there are some things that we know would make a wine not age well, which is if you have really high yields, it seems that wines don't age quite as well. There's not as much concentration. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think in principle, if you want to have a wine that is concentrated enough to age, then the fruit itself has to have sufficient concentration, and that is closely associated to yield. This returns us a bit to Daniel's question, which is how come like you buy a 2010 Pauillac Grand Cru Classé and it's disappointing? One of the things he asks is, is there any way of predicting this process? Is it related to like age or even price? I'll just address the 2010 vintage in Pauillac because I was fortunate enough to taste quite a few of those top wines recently. And it is a vintage that has aged very slowly. The tannins were pretty high because it was a dry year and it was very concentrated, not just through heat, but through lack of water. So you ended up with very concentrated tannins especially, and those have taken a long time to soften. And that does seem to keep the wine less developed than you'd imagine. I mean, they were still very good, but at 15 years old, they certainly weren't as developed as you might expect. So the question is, what do you look for? And I'm going to have to say that this is where websites like jancisrobinson.com come in, because, there's a database of hundreds of thousands of tasting notes of the same wine across many different years from many different people. And so you're able to track where a wine is in its development and how frequently it might have been outstanding or disappointing, and where it might be in recent years. So scores and reviews count for a lot. The other thing I would say is balance at a young age is really important. I remember hearing when I was coming up in the wine trade that, those tannins will soften out. Don't worry about the tannins. The tannins are going to relax and resolve. And I'm increasingly thinking now that if the tannins don't look good when they're young, and by that I mean balance with the acid and the alcohol and the fruit intensity, so that even though it's astringent, you can tell that there is balance. if you don't have that in a young wine, I don't think you have it in an old wine. I've tasted so many older reds where the tannins stick out, and you think, well, it's a really lovely wine in many ways, and I'm not going to throw it away, but those tannins still kind of dry, and they're not going to suddenly resolve in the next few years. They're not going to accelerate their evolution.
I have a hack, and I want you to tell me what you think of this. If I open something and it's young, and then I go back to it the next day and it shows better, and then I go back to it the day after and it shows even better, I think, this I can cellar. Whereas if I go back to it the next day and it's fallen off, then I probably won't cellar it as long. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Firstly, if a wine is not just lasting for 24 hours or more, but actually showing some improvement, then yeah, there must be something to it. Chateau Reyes in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, the guy there recommends that you open his wine 48 hours before you want to drink it, which when you're spending that much money on a wine, you're like, I don't think so, because I don't want to risk it going bad. But I've never done it myself, but a friend, Matt Walls, who writes about the Rhone a lot, he's done it, and he actually says, you know what, it really does make a difference.
But does that depend on the age of the wine?
I think in Reyes they do it routinely, but again, yeah, I'd be very hesitant to do it if I had a 20-year-old bottle and I was worried about its fragility. But for younger wines, yes, if you're noticing it improving over 24 hours. I thought at the beginning you were going to say you put it in a food blender and whizzed it up to see what happened.
No, I watched your video on that and being like, no, this doesn't make any difference whatsoever.
No, it really doesn't.
Don't put your wine in a blender.
No, don't, unless, it's fun for social media, but no.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to question number 3. Andrew from the UK asks,
Hi Richard, my question was, what if anything can be done about the trend for increasing alcohol percentages in wine from regions where temperatures are increasing with global warming, i.e. probably most regions? I understand that also that better viticultural techniques have also contributed to this phenomenon. Increasingly, I find that I am reluctant to pick out the high alcohol wines in my cellar, especially the Châteauneuf-du-Pape and Barolos, and even some Bordeaux seem to be approaching 15%. And this is a bit of a problem because I bought quite a lot 10 to 15 years ago. Now, because of general health reasons, etc., I tend to gravitate towards cooler climate wines, and I was thinking that maybe this is an issue that winemakers in affected regions might need to address. If only they could extract it somehow in the opposite way that chaptalization is sometimes used to boost the alcohol content, and do it without impacting the balance of the wine and its character. Is there an answer? Over to you.
Well, there is a way of extracting sugar from juice, yeah, and there is a way of extracting alcohol from finished wine. That latter example is more familiar these days because of de-alcoholized wines, so 0% wines.
And how do those taste?
Well, this is the big question, isn't it? I haven't had one yet which is really worthy of much attention, although I was literally just reading this morning about this wine, French Bloom, which is a 0% sparkling wine from the Limoux, but it's made by a cousin of the Tattinger family or something like that. And so Jamie Good was actually saying how credible it is as a wine, and I've heard that several times. So maybe it's possible.
I talked to Tam about this because she has tried that one, and I think, if I'm remembering correctly, she said it was fine, but for that price, she wouldn't be happy drinking that. She would want to drink something else, and as her and Tara have written about kombuchas and sparkling teas and how many interesting things you can get there. But that's not the topic at hand.
No, indeed. So one of the things that Andrew mentions is about viticultural techniques, what can be done about that, because ideally, we are in a warming climate, everybody agrees, and the impact on viticulture is ever ripening grapes. And I think there's an implication in his question that not only has global warming increased potential alcohol levels, but also improved viticultural techniques may have done that as well. And that's true because back in the 70s and 80s, when ripeness was not guaranteed, the research was all about how can you improve viticulture so that you maximize the ripeness, so that you increase the sugar in grapes. So to a certain extent, that is a legacy of that period. So now we've got the reverse. How can you manage viticulture without compromising quality, but reduce the potential alcohol in your fruit, which sounds pretty much exactly like a MW question. So let's see how I get on with that. So there are a couple of things that you can do. I mean, if you take it right back to the beginning, you can consider which variety you're planting and which clone of that variety. But if that's not an option, if you're talking about fruit that already exists, vines that are already planted, then yield is one thing. So coming back to what we were saying about yield and the potential for maturity, if you simply increase your yield, then you will, by definition, effectively dilute your intensity, and that includes sugar. So you could increase your yield, or rather avoid decreasing your yield to achieve high intensity fruit. Growers will reduce their yield on the vine. They will literally chop off the grapes, or some of the grapes. That's called a green harvest. If you didn't do that, or if you did some other kind of techniques to try and encourage the fruit to grow more abundantly, then you would reduce potential alcohol.
I have a thought here that applies to the New World much more than it does the Old World. In the New World, and there are so many vineyards in Oregon that are like this, there are even more in California, people will dump on water. They'll set an enormous yield, and then they'll chop off some of that yield. And what ends up happening at that point is you put out so much foliage that you could have ripened much more fruit, but instead you're pumping all of that sugar from photosynthesis into a smaller number of berries and getting incredibly concentrated sugar-ripe berries that are going to be very high alcohol. So there's a group in Oregon called the Deep Roots Coalition, and they believe adamantly, and they've pretty much convinced me, that one of the best ways that you can reduce your alcohol levels naturally is you don't water. You rely on the plant to put on whatever it was going to put on. Some of them will take fruit off, but they're not putting any extra water on. So whatever the canopy is that they get, that's what they get. And that's only going to create a certain amount of sugar. And you're going to end up probably in Oregon, you're likely not going to be above 14%. Mm-hmm. And that sounds high, but in recent years, I have been watching alcohol levels climb in Pinot more and more towards 14.5. And with the DRC, that's not true. So that is one thing that I think is helpful to keep in mind for the New World, but that just doesn't apply to the Old World because people aren't irrigating to begin with.
The Deep Roots Coalition have an unfortunate acronym because DRC makes everybody think of Burgundy, of course.
They did that on purpose. They are little DRC.
So, yes, okay, so there's clearly techniques that you can do that rely more on the natural balance of the plant. But what Andrew's observed, and which is definitely true, is that the classic wines, you know, he mentions Bordeaux and Chateauneuf and Barolo, but it applies equally to Hermitage and, I mean, lots of others, are creeping higher and higher and higher, and we all would prefer, I think, to have the quality without so much high alcohol. So there are certain things that they can do viticulturally, the last of which is picking earlier, but of course that is far from ideal because people pick when the flavors are correct. And if that happens to be at a certain potential alcohol percentage, then that's just a byproduct almost. But anyway, let's just take it to the next point, because he asks about, is there a way that could it be extracted somehow in the way that chaptalization is sometimes used to boost alcohol? So chaptalization is the addition of sugar to grape must to increase alcohol, which, believe it or not, does still happen in some places. But is the reverse possible? And the answer is yes. If you're looking at grape must pre-fermentation, the simplest way is to dilute it, which is basically the same as irrigation, right? It's just happening in the tank. You are just adding water. But of course, that is not a good quality addition, because you're not only diluting the percentage of sugar in the mix, you're diluting everything else. So it happens and it works, but it's probably not a positive thing for quality.
I will say, once in a while, in a state that is as hot as, say, California or other places in the world that are incredibly hot, I don't think that water should be villainized quite as much. They have I've heard it called Jesus units. I've also heard it called your car edition, clear alcohol reducer. And people who dilute their wine a little bit, they do tend to be careful with acidulating the water they're using to the same pH as their wine, the must they're going into. So it's not always the worst idea, but it's rarely, if you're doing it in a volume, it's rarely a good idea.
So yeah, that's hardly the solution that Andrew's looking for. I then found out about something called glucose oxidase, which is an enzyme that reduces glucose. So grape juice has glucose and fructose and probably other sugars in it. But this enzyme has the ability to break down glucose, to oxidize it, so that it's no longer available to yeast as a nutrient, so that it can't be fermented and turned into alcohol. And that theoretically sounds like it works. The problem is that glucose oxidase only works in a certain pH, so you might have to adjust the pH of your wine before you can add it. Plus, it also produces acid as a byproduct. So even though it might reduce your potential alcohol in a less intrusive way than adding water, it's still going to affect the balance of your wine. And no quality producer is going to be willingly do such a manipulation. But it is apparently possible. And then there's a third way, we're still pre-fermentation here, which is called nanofiltration, which is a way of removing sugar from a juice. It's a mechanical intervention, and with all these kinds of activities, it can again be detrimental. I mean, most winemakers would prefer not to manipulate their liquid at all. You know, you don't want to pump it too much. You don't want to filter it too much. You don't want to do anything to it too much. So a kind of extra layer of manipulation called nanofiltration, where you're passing the grape must through tiny little holes, and that is removing glucose. Well, okay, it works, but again, there will be some kind of compromise, presumably to flavor. So after you've got your juice sorted, you then ferment. And probably one of the most credible ways of reducing potential alcohol, at least in my understanding of it, is through yeast. And different yeasts have different efficiencies. So I've read a few different reports of how much of a difference that can make. I think the Oxford Companion cites a difference of 1% alcohol. So if you've got a wine must that has a potential alcohol of 14%, but you use this particular yeast, it will finish as a dry wine at 13%. So that's a pretty good improvement, assuming that the quality of the wine works out well. And then, of course, there's a final thing, which is alcohol reduction, which we've sort of made reference to, where you make a wine as normal, then put it through a process, usually either spinning cone or reverse osmosis. That's a slight simplification. I can't remember exactly how it works.
You just said spinning cone or reverse osmosis with no explanation. I'm going to just chime in for a second here. Spinning cone is kind of like vacuum distillation, where you put something under a vacuum and then you heat it very gently. And because the pressure is different, you can manage to suck some of the alcohol off at a lower temperature than it would generally boil at. So you don't harm the wine, or you don't harm it as much. And then you can kind of piece it back together. And reverse osmosis, well, we know about that because of salt water and all kinds of other things. But continue. Just wanted to...
I thought I could gloss over it. Your explanation was much appreciated. But the point about those things is there are very rarely any examples of wines that have been de-alcoholized to any extent which are considered as good as like an original conventionally made wine.
Even the ones that only de-alcoholize a part, which is becoming more of a trend, and they'll have like a 7% wine, half of it was de-alcoholized, half of it was not, and then they blend it together. Those aren't even any good. No.
And one of the questions is like, is it because it's not being done on the best quality wine? I don't think so. I think it's still too early to
I think it's also, if you are the best quality wine, what is your incentive? Because people who appreciate incredible quality wine, and you're saying, I can sell this, I have people who love it. Are you really going to take it and risk that it wouldn't be as good after you've done it? If you have such a good product. And then there's such an expense with these technologies that you almost have to be huge in order to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the great ironies about de-alcoholized wine, is that you've got to make a regular wine first, then pay to get it de-alcoholized. So the finished product is more expensive than your regular wine. And okay, you might get a tax benefit from it having less alcohol, but on the shelf, a lot of these wines end up costing more. And so people look at it and think, why would I spend more?
It's really environmentally impactful as well. You're using an incredible amount of energy to take alcohol out of a product that naturally had alcohol. So that's a factor too. And,
to go back to Andrew's question, he mentions looking at cool climate alternative areas. And that's what a lot of people are doing. It's perfectly possible to get world-class wine made from cooler areas that are 13%, 13.5%, maybe even 12.5%. They are rarer these days. And the other thing, of course, is that he cites Chateauneuf, Barolo and Bordeaux. I mean, it's very hard to find those at low alcohols these days. So if you're specifically looking for that kind of thing, those are varieties and regions where the style comes from the climate to a large extent, and you can't reproduce that in cooler areas. But you can find other wines which are equally interesting to discover.
And on that note, on the note of classics, Thomas from the UK asks,
Hi Richard, my question is, with a budget of £50 to £100, what are your favourite bottles of Bordeaux, Burgundy and Barolo for drinking right now?
A very good question. And I've come up with a few different ways of approaching this, because what I didn't have immediately was like, oh, here's my list that I keep in my head all the time of the wines that I would buy. So instead, I've somewhat referred to scores, my own scores, but also other people's scores. And of course, I've looked at prices. So I can guarantee, Thomas, that these wines are available at this price in the UK today. At least we're recording this on the 29th of July, 2025. So should we start with Bordeaux?
Yes, let's start with Bordeaux.
So the one that I would buy based on that stipulation, drinking now, £50 to £100, is Chateau Giscourt 2008, which costs £75 currently at Hedonism. We can put links to all of these in the show notes, so you can see references to all of the things we've discussed. On our database, that has 6 scores, 2 of which are 17.5 and 3 of which are 16.5. And some of those are my scores and some of those are other people's. And I think if you're finding a wine that's been that consistent and is now 17 years old and is a classic Bordeaux from Margaux, I would be pretty confident in buying that.
I have not used scores. I've just used my own, what I love. I really love white Bordeaux, which is lucky because it's far less expensive. And you can even get the very best examples for this price point. So Domaine de Chevalier Blanc from 2016, which is one of the best white Bordeaux I've ever tasted, is £99 at Hanford Wines in the UK. Berry Brothers has the 2022 for £102, which is a little bit over budget. And then in California, J.J. Buckley has the 2016 for $126, and they'll ship, and that's still about £100. And that's one of the best white Bordeaux you could buy.
Yeah.
So love that option. And then sweet wines are super undervalued too. So Château de Fargues Sauternes can be had 2008 in a 3-pack, 750s from Berry Brothers for $185, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And then in terms of red, like I said, I don't drink these incredibly often, but when I do and I walk into a shop, we seem to have a lot of Chateau Gloria available in Portland, or it's frequently available, and I have always loved those wines. And they're always at accessible price points, and I can still find the 2015 and 2016 vintages on Wine Searcher for around $55 US. So that
Nice.
would be a good one.
My equivalent of Chateau Gloria would be Cantamerle. So my first answer is you scored 2008. I would never have come up with that. It took me a bit of research, and I'm like, oh, okay, so technically speaking, this is the correct answer, but like, I can't actually really remember the last time I tasted that wine. I'd be very happy to have it again. But Cantamerle, which is an Haute Medoc chateau that's a 5th growth, is really reliable, pretty well known in the UK especially. Back vintage is quite widely available, so I had a quick look. The 2010 right now is £55. So I'd be confident recommending Cantamerle from most vintages. And I did then check my score on that, so I scored that 17 out of 20, which is good enough for me.
I think it's a pretty darn good score for our team. I think we're a bit hard on wines a lot of the time.
So then Burgundy, right, which I had a different approach to, because I looked at the scores on Burgundy and there's so many, and it's so hard to predict what kind of price they're going to be, that I went the other way. I actually went on my instinct for the wine that I really love. And a producer that I've discovered in the last few years is called Fanny Sabre. And she has different appellations and cuvées, as all Burgundians do. But the one in particular that I really like is from Beaune, and it's called Claude Renard. And this is very much my style. It's whole bunch, and it's very stemmy. So it has a particular herbal signature that not everybody will love. The last person I drank this with did not like it at all, who is a fellow MW, so knows what he's talking about. You can get the 2020 vintage at £55 from Buon Vino, and it's just exactly what I want from a Burgundy. And to go back to Thomas's question, he said drinking now. The 2020, in fact, younger vintages of this wine are absolutely drinking now. Yes, you can keep them. I don't think there's a requirement to keep them. They're really, really good. And then the other producer that I would often recommend is Sylvain Patay, who's in Marsanais. And there are lots of different Marsanais that he makes. Actually, the lowest entry-level one would not qualify for this question because it's only £29. That's the Marsanais 2021, and that's available in the Wine Society of the UK. But some of the higher-level Marsanais that he produces are within the £50 to £100. So one is called La Montagne 2022. That's 65 quid from Hedonism. And then the Clos du Roi, which is one of his top wines, I think possibly his very top wine. The The 2015 vintage of that is £99 and 46 pence at Lay and Wheeler, which was just too convenient to ignore. So 2015 vintage, I've tasted a lot of the other 2015s, not that particular one, but the 2015s from Sylvain Pataille, and they were outstanding. So that would be my Burgundy recommendation.
I'm just going to plug a wine of the week I did in November from Domaine Fernand and Laurent Pillot, 2020 Volnay. Drinking really, really well right now. Still available from Lay and Sandman. How do you pronounce that?
Lee and Sandeman, yeah.
Lee and Sandeman. For £48 in the UK, and from Vinopolis in Portland, Oregon, which is where I got it, for $60. And then the other one I actually have two more that I would mention. And I'm sure you know this one, Richard, the Berthaud Gerbet wines.
Yes, only by name. I haven't tasted them a lot.
From Amélie Berthaud, and her husband does the Vit side, and she makes the wine, and she's in Fisan, or at least a part of her property is, and that's a lower priced appellation, so you can get those wines at under £50 a lot of the time. She also rents vines in Gevrey-Chambertin, and those are incredible, but they'll run you more like £75.
Okay.
And then Etienne Sauzet's Pouligny Montrachet still, I think, clocks in just under 100. So I love that one too.
Yeah, Etienne Sauzet was one of the first producers I came across when I started out. We used to sell it at Majestic Wine, where I was working like 20 years ago now. And that was kind of my introduction to white Burgundy. So, yes, big fan of those.
Very funny, because me too. And I just feel like I'm just running along behind you.
Well, I hope it works out in that case. It's
Okay.
Barolo, finally. So this was easier for me because I've got to confess that I like so few of them. It's just not my style. The high tannin is just something that I've never really got on with. And when I've tasted the great examples, I'm like, okay, I get it. I understand the appeal of these wines, and I understand their quality. Personally, not something I drink a lot of. However, one of the producers I've tasted most frequently is called Giacomo Fenocchio. And again, I look back through some of my notes. The Villero Barolo 2015 by Giacomo Fenocchio is £52.20 currently from Davis Bell McCraith in the UK. And they also have the Cannubi 2015 at £55. And both of those wines, I mean, I've tasted multiple times through different vintages. I always like them. I suspect they may be a sort of beginner's Barolo almost, because I like them, and maybe they're a bit less tannic and traditional than some people might like. So that's my one disclaimer, that they may not be in the style that every Barolo lover wants, but for me, they're spot on.
Are they also a bit fruitier, or are they still kind of like savory and slightly oxidative?
I would describe them as being, in terms of flavor profile, exactly what you expect from Barolo. You know, the tar and roses thing?
Yeah.
That's all there. So it's got the complexity, it's got the lifted floral notes, it's savory. It perhaps has more primary fruit than some producers. I mean, the trouble is my sphere of reference here is relatively small because, they're just not wines that I return to very often. However, to answer Thomas's question, those wines, Giacomo Fenocchio, they're all between 50 and 100, and there's quite a few mature vintages available in the market.
That's so fun. I think that's really funny that you're not a Barolo lover. I love Barolo. I can't often afford it, but I went on a trip a number of years ago, and I got to meet Chiara Boschis, and then I had no idea who she was. But subsequently, I went and watched The Barolo Boys, which is a wild, weird film that goes on forever if you haven't seen it. And she's in there. The lone Barolo girl and the Barolo boys, and her 2020 Cannubi is still under 100 pounds by the 6-pack at the Fine Wine Co. in the UK. So I'd go with that. They're really delicate and pretty, so I like them a lot. And then if I couldn't find that, Macchiarini's Brunate.
Okay, yeah, why not? I mean, that's a wine I know by reputation for sure.
It's so classic.
Yeah,
I love a wine that is exactly what you'd expect it to be.
Yes, yeah, and that's a kind of running theme from all of these questions, right? It's like the champagne one. What is classic and non-classic? What's within the appellation? What's outside the appellation? Then we had the thing about viticulture and, you know, how you could manage alcohol levels. We've had this question about which would be the classics for Bordeaux, Barolo, and Burgundy. And then aged wines and what you classically expect. And, well, as a disclaimer, in case I've made some terrible mistakes or been accurate, we will put corrections in the show notes as well. So if there's anything I've said which is out of place, or if we need to give any references or cite anything, then it'll all be in the show notes. So now I've covered myself.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, everyone who submitted, and please submit more.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.